Well, thank you both very much. I now recognize myself for questions. And I agree with both of you, to start off, that it's important that our focus be forward-looking. And as you know, many of our current biosafety and biosecurity policies and regulations, many have been enacted in response to specific events. For instance, the Federal Select Agent Program was effectively created in response to improper orders of plague strains by an unauthorized individual, and was subsequently bolstered in response to the 2001 anthrax letter attacks. I heard both of you saying some of the things Congress can do, and it's appreciated. You talk about investments and investments into what? You got specific. Appreciate that as well, and the role of oversight. And the role of the State Department internationally should be well defined, I think. That's something that we can try to do and recommend. Internationally, I do take concern when I look at an organization like the World Health Organization, which I would like to see it be more independent, aside from the United Nations, which is full of political realm, but may be separate from that, and not be under the influence of its members that have a political agenda. And I don't think I need to go into much detail on that. The question is, if we can establish an international organization, what do you recommend as far as how we enforce biosafety and biosecurity? And I'm going to ask both of you that question, your opinions on that, as you both have dealt internationally many times.
Yeah, I think the question of enforcement is really the hard one. And I guess that's why my recommendation first and foremost is focused on recommitment to diplomacy. And there's some actually good efforts already underway in the State Department, working with the G7 countries, and USDA is part of that, to try, but it's a small effort to try to just encourage collaboration on harmonization of high containment standards and norms and work with infectious agents, but it just needs to be elevated as a secretarial priority and resourced appropriately. But I think for those diplomatic negotiations and collaborations, I think some additional ideas will come out of those conversations and through diplomacy about how to better strengthen the World Health Organization so it can be less dependent upon regional offices than member states within their regional office, because the Director General does need some support. But there are other ideas too that could be considered that I think would come out of those diplomatic conversations. But first and foremost, member states, all of us, United States, all member states of the WHO or the United Nations, we all have a responsibility to make sure that we have the appropriate guidelines, laws, regulations in our own countries. And so how do we encourage all member states to make sure that they do what they need to do and assume their responsibility and accountability to make sure their institutions have the right norms, ethical values. If they're operating high containment labs, they have to have the appropriate skilled workforce funding and so forth to do so. So the international community can have better confidence in these labs.
Thank you. Dr. Yasif?
Thank you. I think the question of how to strengthen global approaches to biosafety and biosecurity through stronger international institutions is really important, and I agree with Jerry that the enforcement part is going to be really challenging, and before we can even envision that possible future, we need to do a lot of groundwork to lay a foundation, to have a shared understanding globally of what the rules of the road are and what are the best practices for biosafety and biosecurity that we would like to see that can meaningfully reduce risks, and I think that's going to take a lot of work. One of the efforts that we're really focused on through IBIS is to help to build that foundation. We envision that IBIS will serve as a resource to help countries as well as members in the private sector, in industry and academia and civil society to sort of share and develop best practices so we can raise the bar both domestically and internationally. I would say that nations have an enlightened self-interest in advancing biosecurity and biosafety. No one wants to see a lab leak or some sort of catastrophic event from within their borders. And I think that we can enhance that through transparency and accountability of implementing best practices in biosafety and biosecurity. That's why we track those kinds of provisions through our Global Health Security Index that I mentioned during my testimony. And I think Nations should be accountable to each other for upholding biosafety and biosecurity standards, and by tracking that, we can support that. Last thing I'll say is WHO is one place that can carry out this work. The BWC is another piece of it, and they both are international institutions that have credibility internationally, and it'll be important to have them at the table to continue to advance this work. But I do think that other complementary institutions like IBIS can support that work and take on some of the tasks of innovation and taking risk in developing best practices that may be harder for some of the UN-based institutions to do. And I think together we can really drive progress.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that maybe here in the United States we can set the gold standard with a high level of expectations and be the example for others. And it just seems to me that if a certain nation is not cooperating, then we point that out to the world, and they no longer are part of the international organization. Just a thought going forward. I do have a question, because we talked a lot about dual use research into dual use, and I'm just curious, what positives have come out of dual use research in the last decade or so, and maybe more specifically to gain of function or creation of chimeras? What positives have come out of that type of research?
Well, by definition, dual use, let me just take the dual use part of that question first. So dual use, I would say by far the most, dual use is good and bad. And so most of our scientific advances in biotechnology and biomedicine, by far the vast majority of those advancing technologies are improving our way of life, our health, our well-being, our economy, our agriculture. So these are important technologies that we need to continue to innovate and foster. But there's another side to that dual use, and that's the bad. And so how do we mitigate the misuse of the potential of these advancing technologies of somebody who wants to do harm?
Well, and I guess what I'm asking specifically, if you look at what has taken place, is one, obviously, potential for a bioweapon, right? And let's not kid ourselves on that. So what are the positives? If you're advancing research that can lead to a bioweapon, are we advancing research that also can lead to something good? What is that good?
Well, I don't think the intent of most of the life sciences are to develop an advancing technology that's going to be misused. I think our issue is how do we control and mitigate the misuse of it. And almost anything that we have throughout humankind, somebody has figured out how to misuse technology that we develop. Now, I think you're really kind of getting to the enhanced dual use, especially dangerous gain-of-function research is what you're really getting at, and what benefits have come out of that research. And I think we have to be realistic about those benefits, and I think we have to be realistic about how what those benefits are. And I can see where there's possibly a need for basic science knowledge advancement with some of this research. I'm not going to negate that could be useful, but I think we have to be very careful in not exaggerating the benefits of that type of research. And so I'm not going to prejudge that somebody may come with a good idea that there may be a need to engage in a dual use, especially dangerous, enhanced pathogen research that might advance our basic science knowledge if it's good for public health, too. But that's why we need to have additional oversight of that. And actually, we need to we need to be incentivizing safer alternatives, because many believe that safer alternatives can be used for answering the basic science questions for most of these proposed research proposals. So we need to really incentivize safer alternatives, and if one is justified, I mean really justified, and the risks are mitigated, and there's verification that there's no safer alternatives, and there's public transparency, then it just needs to be reviewed, and there's nothing wrong with having a review. And so I think a lot of folks don't like the extra review.
Thank you. Dr. Yes, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I largely agree with my colleague. You know, I think our colleagues in the molecular biology and virology community would share that, you know, for example, gain-of-function research in their view is important for advancing public health and development of medical countermeasures. But I agree that we do have to, on the balance, consider that with downside risks of accidental or deliberate misuse. That's a really serious set of considerations we need to balance, and figuring out how to do that while we improve as we improve our oversight practices to figure out what kind of research should go forward and what kind of research perhaps should not, because the cost-benefit calculation doesn't make sense. I think that there's more work to be done to figure out how to thread the needle there, and it's a really hard question. So some of the work that the administration is doing to revise oversight and to revise review processes for funding decisions is going to have to figure out how to do this well, and I think that's where we really need to focus our efforts at the moment.
Thank you. I appreciate the feedback from both of you. Dr. Ruiz.